Hello and welcome to the Classical Liberal Project. I am Jonathan Casey, chair of the Classical Liberal Caucus. With me, as always, is Joshua Eagle on the board as well, and we've got Dave Smith of part of the Problem podcast. Welcome, Dave. Thanks for coming on.
What's up, fellas? Thanks for having me.
No, thanks for coming. I wanted to give you a shout out early on, Dave, before we got into the whole shebang around NATO. I think you were catching a little bit of criticism internally from some of the people in Mises about kind of coming on this show and having the conversation. And one of the things that you said was, like, if we can't change their mind, then it was something like, we can't change their mind, it's not worth doing. Having these conversations is like very important. And I really appreciate you like going out of your way to do this. So it really means a lot.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. What I said was that it was Karen Ann Harlos, who I love very dearly.
Yep.
And she said, she was like, oh, you're just going to be getting more viewers to their channel. And I was like, well, yeah, but like if anyone like is they're coming here to watch your show because they're a fan of mine.
Right.
If they're more persuaded by what you have to say than what I have to say, then I deserve to lose them. Like that's the correct answer. And if I'm like my whole thing, and I've always felt this way, is like, well, I'm confident they won't be. So that's the whole point. And then I'm confident I'm more likely to at least get you guys or your audience to go, all right, he's got a good point on that or on that. And so, but I mean, what shot, the libertarians have if we can't do that anyway? So,
well said. Yeah.
We might as well pack it. We might as well pack it in if we don't feel like we can do that.
I just wanted to say thank you for that early on. So that's great. Sure. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I think we're gonna have a great time.
Sure.
Awesome. I figured. Oh, go ahead, Josh.
No, I was going to let you take it away.
Oh, there we go. I was going to go ahead and let everybody kind of introduce where they're at on NATO. Dave, if you want to lead us off, I'll go second. And Josh can finish it off, and then you can go right into it.
Sure. Well, I mean, I think I oppose NATO in every sense that you could oppose it. I think we kind of went back and forth on what we would talk about when we were talking about doing like a debate resolution, and I understand where you could say like their mission or what they claim to be is, hey, we're in a defensive alliance that's just here to, like, if we're a group that if anyone attacks any of us, we're all going to defend ourselves. And however you would feel about entangling alliances, objectively, that's not what they are. In the same sense that, I don't know, if we're just going by what people call themselves, then the Patriot Act was patriotic, and then I don't know. I think the Congo is a democratic republic. Like anyone can call themselves what they want to. In reality, NATO is the European military alliance of the American empire. And that's the objective reality as far as I'm concerned. And we are nothing short of an empire, as everyone in this space knows, whatever the numbers exactly are today. So 700 bases in 135 countries or something like that. Now you think like 135 countries. How many Americans can name 30 countries? Yet we've got bases in over 130 of them. And America is our federal government is the most war-hungry government in the world. In the 21st century, there's really no arguing that. There's no one who's invaded more countries, bombed more countries, killed more innocent people. We truly are the greatest purveyors of violence in the world, which is why all of our leaders sound like the biggest hypocrites in the world. And they try to call Vladimir Putin out for being a war criminal. It's like, as the great Scott Horton likes to say, like you're standing in a swimming pool filled with the blood of innocent people yelling at someone else about how they're wrong. And NATO, of course, has conducted several horrific aggressive wars. Most recently, they were instrumental in the 20-year just disaster that was the war in Afghanistan. They were also instrumental in the war in Libya. Both of these wars between the two of them were responsible for the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people and just wreaked nothing but destruction in all parts of the world. I mean, if Libya actually also led to a huge migrant crisis into Europe, even the rise of far right political movements in Europe, which I'd imagine both of you guys would probably really oppose. It's very directly related to NATO's war in Libya. I think that it's been, I believe it was Eisenhower said that if this thing isn't over in 5 years, then we've failed when it first started, and he was the head of NATO. Basically, the idea was that we would stick around until France and Germany could defend themselves, and then we'd be out of there. But of course, it's a government program. So government programs, are the self-licking ice cream cone. Once there's not the reason to be there, then they just find a new reason. Of course, if you had listened to the propaganda from NATO for 50 years, then you would have, of course, assumed as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed, they would cease to exist, because that was the whole point. But what did they do when the Soviet Union collapsed? They expanded. It's like, if that's not a government program, I don't know what is. The whole reason for existing goes away. And now you go, we need more power. We need to expand. I also think NATO has been incredibly provocative toward Russia and is a huge portion of the responsibility of the situation that we find ourselves in today in Ukraine. So overall, I just think it's been an awful organization that is just, like I said, the European wing of the American empire. I think that to me, it's kind of like, and this is where all of this started. I'll wrap up soon. But the idea of NATO being like consistent with the non-aggression principle or defensive or voluntary or any of this. Look, I assume you guys are minarchists. I could be wrong about classical liberals.
No, that's accurate. Yeah, for sure.
In that, so even like, to me, very quickly, the anarchist perspective, I think, would be like, to very quickly sum it up. Okay, we believe in the non-aggression principle and private property rights. And if you're following the non-aggression principle to its logical conclusion, you can't have a state at all. The minarchist position is more like the state should exist only to protect people's liberty. And if it does less than that, people's liberty is in jeopardy. If it does more than that, it's tyrannical. Okay.
Fair assessment.
Yeah, I agree.
So even from the minarchist perspective, I mean, all the member states of NATO, there's no night watchman state that's a member of NATO. These are modern super states, the biggest criminal organizations in the world. This is like saying like the Crips and the Bloods and the Latin Kings formed a fighting alliance together and then saying, but it's totally voluntary. Like, no, it's not. It's all based off what they've stolen from their communities and then funded this thing. And then, oh, they're defensive, except for when they're not, which is also true for like the Russian military. They're a defensive military, except all the times they're not, so I don't know. I just think if there's anything libertarians should be, we should be opposed to all of this. And the best of the libertarian legacy, like, go read like Murray Rothbard during the Cold War. This is what was so cool about libertarians, is that we're like, hey, we're the most anti-commie motherfuckers out there. And we reject the Cold War because we recognize that that's just commie shit too. Like, that's just more communism. And it's like what Bill Buckley said. We need a, totalitarian bureaucracy in our shores. And we're like, no, we don't. So, of course, I think the libertarian position is to reject every inch of NATO and, at the very least, push for America to get out of it. Okay, done there.
All right, I'll go real quick because I've got the most boring position on this. My opinion is that America should get out of NATO, stay out, and Europe should be left to the defense of Europe. If there was a case, I could imagine a situation where we would need to come to the defense of Europe like we did in World War II, but that should be our decision to make alone. That's it. And so that's my position. As like I said, it's short and boring. So I'll hit it over to Josh.
Yeah. So I think where the core of our disagreement comes in is because I think you and I on our Twitter thread, we went back and forth about this. We both are very much opposed to NATO intervention in Bosnia and in Serbia and in Afghanistan, and I think the most recent one was in Libya. But I think the core of where our disagreement is I see NATO as less of a purveyor of that, and I see more of that as something caused by U.S. military action. And I see NATO as kind of a separate from that. And I'll kind of set that up and maybe explain why I think that is. But overall, I think NATO is very voluntary, which I think we might agree on. It's kind of a voluntary organization. You can choose to stay, choose to leave. And it's structurally defensive. Like, it's set up in a way to not be an offensive aggressor towards other people. It might, as I think you alluded to, had made decisions in the past to support U.S. aggression and kind of come alongside them and maybe act in that way. But overall, I don't think the institution is set up to do that. I don't think the institution does that. And I don't think the institution is designed to do that and is structurally set up that way. One of the things I'll touch on before I get into some of the other points you made, Dave, and then we can go back and forth, was when I say NATO structurally defensive, I'm referring specifically to the fact that NATO has never started a war. So the U.S. government has, and I think that's a proven fact. Like, we agree with there has been probably no other more aggressive organization other than the U.S. government. They have, tried to do regime change across the world. They've done a lot of very bad things that we both agree with or disagree with. But NATO itself has never started a war or led an offensive conflict. NATO has never dragged someone into a war that they didn't want to be dragged into. I mean, structurally, again, NATO requires a unanimous vote for Article 5. And also, you can leave at any time. And in order to join, you have to have unanimous support to join that institution, that organization. And then I think that NATO is less of a military organization, because NATO really is just made up of member states that have militaries that kind of agree to do things together sometimes. And it's more of kind of like a political organization that reduces that. Yeah, I think in action reduces tension and overall results in less conflict, especially in Europe and in that kind of area. There's a lot of stuff that you mentioned that I'd like to dig into, that I wanted to go back and forth with you on, that I think are some nuance. Like you mentioned NATO expansion. You mentioned the fact that NATO has been provocative towards Russia. I think you mentioned that it's kind of acted aggressively in Europe. And so I want to get into those. But I think the first thing I was going to ask you before we even got into the nuance was one simple question. If you could change anything, so if Dave Smith could have anything he wanted here, would you be able to make any changes or recommendations to NATO that you think would make it more compatible with libertarianism and kind of your perspective on the world? Is there anything that NATO could change structurally about itself that would maybe be more aligned, that Dave Smith would think, okay, that's something that I can endorse? And the reason I ask this is because I think people like somebody that I know you respect, like Hoppe, for example, has come out and said that like there is a place for defensive alliances. You and I agreed on this on the thread, like defensive alliance, military alliances are in line with libertarianism. But what would you change about NATO specifically that maybe would be more in line with worldview?
Oh, okay. So yeah, I mean, I think in theory, a defensive alliance could be in line with libertarianism. My argument is that NATO is not a defensive alliance. I also still, even though it's within, like, it could be theoretically a defensive alliance could be consistent with libertarian principles. There's still very tricky things. This is why, like, our founders warned us against entangling alliances. It's not because they were like these strict anarcho-capitalists or something like that. They were just saying, like, look, you know, if you make war guarantees to somebody else, this can have the effect of spreading a war much wider. And in fact, this has led to much wider wars than we would otherwise have in the past. They're very dangerous things. So I'm not saying they in theory couldn't be consistent with libertarianism, but I think they should still be, like, you should be very concerned about entering into them. Okay, that being said, okay, I kind of agree. Let me answer. I'm sorry, let me finish answering your question and then I'll respond to some of what you said. I mean, look, I'm one of these people, and I think this gets libertarians triggered sometimes. I'm like, at least in my opinion, maybe not in some of yours, but I'm a very like hardcore radical purist libertarian. But I try my best not to make the perfect the enemy of the good. So I'd be happy with anything that was a little bit better than the status quo. So like, what would make NATO better? Well, what would make them better? I don't know. I think if they signed a pledge to never admit Ukraine in exchange for Vladimir Putin giving back, you know, a ceasefire and at least giving back some of the territory, I'd be happy with whatever led to less bloodshed in the moment and took the threat of nuclear war, at least to some degree, off the table. Better than that would be America pulling out of NATO. Which, by the way, if we were to do that and negotiate with Putin, we could get whatever we wanted. Just to be clear right now, there's no political chance that that's going to happen under current conditions. But if we were to say to Vladimir Putin, America will leave NATO, if you leave, we could get whatever we want, because that'd be such a bigger victory for him than keeping the Donbass region. You know what I mean? Like, maybe not Crimea, but we could get anything else we wanted. That would be better. Better than that would be the whole thing being absolved. Okay. But let me just respond to a couple things you said. It's not that I'm disagreeing with you that America, yes, America's running the show. Washington, D.C. is who's running the show. I'm not claiming that NATO is dragging them into wars, but NATO is our European outlet. And in fact, you agreed that you think the war in Syria, the war in Serbia was horrible. NATO was the excuse for that. We couldn't get a UN resolution. And because Russia had veto power. And so Bill Clinton just broke the law and just said, we're just going to do it through NATO. And even though we had promised this was going to be transitioning to like a political organization, well, no, it's not a political organization when it's launching aggressive wars. And that was the excuse, was that we're doing it through NATO. So that's kind of just as good as the UN, even though it's a violation of international law. And by the way, this had a huge impact on our relationship with Russia. In fact, this is, if you listen to Vladimir Putin's the speech before he gave two, but if you listen to his speeches before he invaded Ukraine, this is one of the things that he blasted us for, in that kind of typical Putin way where he has this dry Russian sense of humor, like where he was like, he goes, well, I mean, there's an ethnic minority being targeted, so it's totally justified to invade, right, Bill Clinton? And then he was like, we got to check out about weapons of mass destruction, right, George W. Bush? And he kind of like went down the list of American presidents. And look, even if you're completely against Putin invading, as I am, you got to at least admit, man, we hand him this great talking point of what hypocrites we are to like, what ground do we have to stand on to be like, you know, you can't invade a sovereign country. You can't kill innocent people. Like, yeah, okay. Like anyone's going to listen to the United States of America talk about that. But so anyway, no, it's not. This isn't, again, I'm saying it's not voluntary. And look, I understand. I'm sorry, I'll turn it back over to you in a sec. But I understand like the argument of like, it's voluntary in the sense that, you know, normies think of it. Like France left and came back. Okay, they can leave. And I guess we're not really forcing governments to join. I mean, if they don't want to, we might sponsor a colored revolution and then put in a regime that wants to. Okay, but more or less, it's like the nations can decide. But what you were saying on Twitter and these god-awful takes is that you're like, it is the non-aggression principle applied. And it's consistent with libertarianism and it's defensive. And so like by the libertarian definition of voluntary, like, no, it's not. It's funded by stolen money. And like, even from the minarchist perspective, it's funded by stolen money. So it's none of those things. It's just, yes, Washington, D.C. is the empire. NATO is our satellite, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't oppose our satellite just because they're not in charge.
Okay, a couple thoughts on that. So there's 4 or 5 things that I think you mentioned that I want to dig into, because
Sure.
I think you also alluded to some stuff at the very beginning, which I think is also interesting to get into. So first and foremost, I think one of the things that I would like to say, if I had the magic wand and I could create a dream world where, you know, it's just, you know, theoretical, I would love to see a NATO return to its kind of pre-USSR, no military action, just simply a defensive alliance, right? There's no any intervention period. It's just, we all agree to do this, right? So that would be the ideal case for me. And I think that I just wanted to say that first, because you had kind of alluded to that. Before we get into the funding with stolen money and the hypocrisy, because I agree with you, the US is, of all organizations, probably one of the most hypocritical on this, because again, we just got finished with a 20-year regime change war, and lecturing somebody else is pretty hypocritical. Now, that's not to downplay the fact that Putin is killing innocent people and launch an invasion. No matter what we did, that doesn't really change the fact that that's evil and wrong, and it's taking, you know, liberty and life from people that they shouldn't lose. But can we talk about NATO expansion first? So one of the things that you'd mentioned earlier, that NATO is expanding, and that Putin had kind of mentioned that in his speech as to why, one of the reasons why he invaded Ukraine. One of the things that I think you mentioned, and I did watch your appearance on Joe Rogan. It was great to have libertarian voices there talking about these ideas on such a huge platform, was this not 1 inch east thing. I think Putin even mentioned this in his speech, like, we're not going to go 1 inch east. The narrative around that, I think, is wrong for a couple of reasons. So first and foremost, there was a treaty signed in 1990 by Gorbachev in the United States that didn't have any sort of NATO commitment whatsoever. And I think you're probably aware of this. Like, there was never a time where we, in a writing, in a treaty, in any agreement, said we're not expanding east. But I also take issue with the idea that NATO, like calling it NATO expansion, almost, I think, is a problematic way to describe it in and of itself. And the reason I say that is because it kind of insinuates that it's an involuntary action. And one of the things about NATO expansion post 1990 was it was driven by these countries that independently decided that they wanted to associate with NATO. It's not like we forced them to do that. They voluntarily made this decision to do that. And this happened over and over again. And in a way, Russian aggression, like in the aughts, right, actually escalated the situation and made it more likely. And it's one of the reasons why Finland and Sweden are thinking about doing it now, is because they feel insecure, threatened by, this superpower, this nuclear superpower, and they want to associate with somebody who's going to give them autonomy. I mean, like, the requirements to join NATO are very in line, I think, with things that we agree with. Like, if you want to be a part of NATO, you can't have a territorial dispute. So Ukraine's out, and Ukraine's been out since 2008 when they were rejected, but they have to uphold democracy. They have to be making progress towards a free market. They've got to have their military forces under civilian control. They can't have any disputes, as I mentioned earlier. They can't be like, have a Crimea occupied and then join. And they have to be working towards compatibility with NATO. So, like, again, when you look at the entire picture, calling it expansion almost it feels to me like we're downplaying this as an independent people saying, I want to associate with this group. Well, and as libertarians, I think we should say that's okay.
Well, it's not independent people saying they want to join with this group. It's gigantic modern nation states saying they want to join with this group.
Do you think the Baltic states chose to join NATO, or were they pushed into it?
Well, I mean, a mix of both. I mean, I don't know. They're bribed with essentially like free defense. So like, yeah, I'm not even arguing that they chose. You said it's independent people. That's objectively false. Well, hold on. Let me respond. There's so much there that is like, okay, so it's not. Now, first off, the term expansion does not imply anything involuntary. You could talk about a business expanding. The term expansion just implies that you're getting bigger and taking over more and more area, which is objectively what's going on. And so, you know, if you can say that you liked the original, you know, kind of goal of NATO, even though the stated reason for existing doesn't exist post-Soviet Union, but okay, but that was like, you know, west of the Elbe River. That's, you know, so that's a kind of whole different ball game. Now, in terms of NATO expansion, I want to get into a few of these things, because it's not just that Putin mentions that NATO expansion was something that was a provocation to him and he believed was a security concern. And this isn't even just something like that you'd go, look, from the very beginning in the 90s, it's not as if it was just Ron Paul and Harry Brown, like our, you know, tradition of ideas, who were people warning against this, that this would be a provocation to Russia and that we shouldn't expand NATO. It's not just, it wasn't them. It wasn't just like the dissidents like Pat Buchanan or Noam Chomsky or something like that. Like the wisest people within the national security apparatus, many former secretaries of defense, Robert McNamara, Robert Gates, who was the CIA director at the time, who was later, of course, George W. Bush's defense secretary, and then Obama's defense secretary, William Perry, who was Bill Clinton's secretary. I mean, you could go on and on of all of these people within the national security apparatus who were like, no, this is a really bad idea. George Kennan, who was the champion Cold Warrior, the founder of the containment strategy, the guy, you know, like Robert McNamara and George Kennan, the people who like fought the Vietnam War, you know what I mean? Like slaughtered millions of innocent people for nothing in the name of this containment strategy. Even they were like, there's a great piece, it was in the New York Times, where Thomas Friedman is interviewing George Kennan, the Cold Warrior. He's like in his 90s at this point, and he's losing his mind. And he's like, what are you guys doing? We just won the Cold War, and now you're starting another Cold War. Why would we even be talking about doing this? And he predicted that, he goes, this NATO expansion is going to continue, and then Russia is going to react. And then everyone who is on board with the NATO expansion is going to say, see, look, this is why we had to expand this whole time. And this is exactly what's happened. And every single one of these people, the reason they warned against this, it wasn't for just like pure libertarian reasons, which, by the way, all of us should agree with, that like, you know, this whole thing is a giant government program. We're subsidizing the defense of Europe, who has wealth, has less debt than we have. Why are we doing this? It's going to lead to like all the problems that government programs have. They all had one unanimous objection, that this was going to provoke Russia. And let me just fast forward a little bit, because I think you got like your facts wrong about what happened and what led to what. Like, yes, there were more and more states that wanted to join NATO, but here was the real deal, right? Okay. And have either of you guys ever read the Niet Means Niet memo from the CIA director Burns? He's current CIA director. He was the ambassador to Russia at the time.
No, but I'm happy to learn.
So.
Okay. So let me see if I can actually pull this up so I can read it to you and not just like kind of give you my my best recollection of it. Okay, here I have it, very recent on my phone here. Okay, so Julian Assange got us this document and sacrificed his life to do so. So in 2008, the current CIA director, Burns, he was the ambassador to Russia. And he wrote this memo to Condoleezza Rice. This was in, I believe, February of 2008. It was, let me just double check that it's February, but I'm pretty sure, yes, it was February 2008, okay? So in February 2008, he writes this memo to Condoleezza Rice, the Secretary of State at the time. And this is what he said. He said, Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. In more than 2.5 years of conversations with key Russian players, from knuckle draggers in the darkest recesses of the Kremlin to Putin's sharpest liberal critics, I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine in NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests. He also wrote, it would be hard to overstate the strategic consequences of bringing Ukraine into NATO. It will, and this is his words, it will create fertile soil for Russian meddling in Crimea and Ukraine. 3 months after that, at the Bucharest summit, they announced that Ukraine and Georgia would be entering NATO. 3 months after that, Russia went to war in Georgia.
Correct.
Now, this is not like the idea that all of these people were predicting, you do this, this will happen. Then they did this, then this happened. And then you go, oh, that's so crazy to think there was a relationship between the two.
Well,
Look,
I don't actually.
You saw me on I'm sorry, let me just say this and then I'll pass back.
Yeah, go for it.
As you saw me on Rogan, and I'm very proud that I got this in front of like 30, 40 million people. Even Gideon Rose, the editor of Foreign Affairs magazine, the publication of the Council on Foreign Relations, he goes, as he was talking about, we're trying to steal Ukraine away from Russia. He goes, now the risk here is that Russia invades Ukraine. That's the risk, that they could knock over the chess table, as he said. And Colbert's like, could he invade? Like, yeah, he could. But we'll distract him with the Olympics. We'll do all this other stuff. And then through the Trump years, it's like, oh, we'll send in these weapons, but it'll be enough to deter Russia from invading. Well, it looks like it either didn't deter them or maybe it even provoked them into doing it. So again, I'm not saying Vladimir Putin has no responsibility for this. I just think it's insane for anyone who's actually followed this to like not even consider the possibility that moving your hostile military alliance all the way up to someone else's borders while the whole time they're screaming, I have security concerns about this. This is a real threat to our national security. When we know we would do the same. We have a fucking Monroe Doctrine. If any faraway power ever tried to fucking bring Mexico or Canada into their military alliance, we'd go to fucking war with them over that. And we all know this. So why can't we just put the shoe on the other foot and go, okay, he's wrong for invading. He's a thug and a war criminal. All our politicians are thugs and war criminals, but he's at least got a point on that.
So I don't think that we should, I guess the Monroe Doctrine is actually interesting because that was something I was going to mention. I mean, I don't think we should let Russia's Monroe Doctrine determine the future of Ukrainians. Does that make sense? So really the core of what I'm trying to touch on here is that now you and I think this was one of the things that when I was thinking about this conversation before we were going to have it, I had a feeling that we were going to have a really big sticking point on whether governments can represent their people. And I think you touched on that earlier. Criminal gangs, sure. Criminal gangs, I think, can still have voluntary interactions and relationships with each other. So I think that's an important distinction to make. Like you could still be a criminal gang and then have a voluntary agreement with another criminal gang. So I think that dynamic is notable. But I also think that we have to operate under the assumption that, at least for the sake of the conversation, that governments at least are there to represent people. And even if they aren't, let's just say hypothetically in the United States, we have one military. And obviously you think the military should have no association with NATO. I think it should. So I think that's why we have representative democracy, is to kind of sort through those issues, answer that question, because we can't like split the military down the middle and make that decision. So I think that is a kind of a note that I'd like to touch on early.
Well, I'll just one quick thing. I don't operate under the assumption that governments are representatives of their people because I'm a libertarian.
I understood. Now there's obviously flaws to be made. There's massive flaws in the way that governments operate, but I think that like, for example, representative democracies are far more aligned with representing their people than like Putin's Russian imperial authoritarian states. And so again, some are better than others, but we have to have systems in place to make these decisions, and no system's going to be perfect. Some are more perfect than others. But I actually don't think that's worth talking about, because I feel like you and I would probably go back and forth on that for a long time. That's basically the minarchist versus anarchist argument.
Well,
right?
Yeah, but I don't even think it is. I don't think it's a minarchist versus anarchist split. I think you could be a minarchist and completely recognize that the idea that our government, look, if you were to look at the most unpopular federal policies in the last 100 years, you know what would rank right up at the top? Were the banker bailouts of 2008. And what did we just see? Another round of banker bailouts. We're probably going to get more. The idea that because we get to vote for either Trump or Biden in 2020 and therefore they represent us, I think is a naivete of the highest order, especially for a libertarian. None of these governments represent us.
I think that you have to look at with the Baltic states and the other states that joined NATO. If you look at their populations, they are very glad they're in NATO. They are
Sure.
Like, I don't think you can have any dispute that those populations absolutely chose and wanted to be in NATO, because to be in NATO, you have to fundamentally change. I mean, they did this in 14 years. They went from the USSR to representative democracy with open free market, with mostly free markets, right? That's that they chose that path on purpose because they were afraid. They are afraid of Russia, and it's not just because of warnings. I mean, the NATO did sit down with Russia and hold their hand through a lot of this. In '97, there was the NATO Russian Defending Act. In 2001, I mean, listen, there was a NATO office in Moscow until 2021. So it's not like we didn't reach out to them. It's not like we didn't talk to them and say, hey, we're not going to throw a bunch of troops or nukes into these new countries. Well, so we did talk to them about that.
There's some truth to that. You could also look at it from the other perspective that they talked to NATO. I mean, Russia at one point wanted to join NATO. Now, you can make arguments on either side about like exactly how they proceeded. You know, Russia certainly had a level, which I think personally, I think is kind of understandable, that they were like, hey, we want to join NATO. And they were like, well, you can get in line and apply. And they were like, no, we're Russia. We're like the whole reason NATO was formed. Now,
if Russia was willing to go down that path, let them.
Well, okay, but I'm just saying you could make arguments on either side. Okay, there were times where, and actually there was a point when the relationship with Russia and NATO was not nearly as toxic as it is today.
Yes,
I'm not arguing. I mean, I don't know, but I'd probably agree with you that probably people in the Baltic states wanted to join NATO, and I think in general, like I would understand why a lot of people in countries that are like small countries near Russia would want to be a part of NATO. Like, why wouldn't you want the most badass, military in the world, kind of guaranteeing, not exactly guaranteeing, but kind of guaranteeing your defense, and also kind of subsidizing your defense. So, yeah, I'm not saying there's nothing there. I'm making the point that we shouldn't do it. I'm saying we shouldn't bring them in because the dangers are far worse than the rewards for us. And if you're saying that the idea is that the government is supposed to represent the American people, the government here in the United States of America, well, then the truth is that, like, look, it sucks that little countries get bullied by big countries. We're the biggest bullies out of all of them. I'd like us to first work on not being bullies to little countries. I'd also like other big countries to stop being bullies. But what we're engaging in right now is the most insane, reckless policy perhaps in the history of the United States of America. We're closer to a nuclear conflict right now than we've been since the Cuban Missile Crisis. For what?
But
this most corrupt government in Ukraine gets to maintain their sovereignty, who's not even a NATO member, by the way. It's not like they're not even a NATO country. But like what? Like the most corrupt government in Europe versus what? The other most corrupt government in Europe, where there's historical ties. Like, I don't know. Do you guys really think, like, even as minarchists, do you really think like the lines on a map are drawn perfectly? Is it so clear that Crimea is supposed to be a part of Ukraine, or even that the Donbass is supposed to be a part of Ukraine? I wish Vladimir Putin didn't invade. I hate that there's innocent people dying, but the idea that we should be, what we're engaged in right now is just utter madness. Like, you got the president of the United States openly talking about how the goal here is to overthrow Vladimir Putin multiple times, saying this. By the way, according to the former defense secretary, William Perry, and I assume he might be right about this, he says Vladimir Putin believes that's the policy of the United States of America, to kill him. Now, he's got no way of actually hurting us. He's got no way of taking over Europe. This guy was sitting on a $1.5 trillion GDP before the war. He's struggling to win this current conflict. He's not reconstituting the Soviet Union. He's not getting anywhere near the original NATO countries. He's not taking over Poland. It's just not happening. But he does have the biggest nuclear arsenal in the freaking world. And we're telling him we're going to kill you. And you're going to lose a war right on your border. Like, this is fucking madness, dude. If libertarians believe in anything, it's like, yeah, you don't get involved in shit like this. And why is it? Why is everyone supposed to pretend we care so much about the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine? It's like the same thing as that they did with Kosovo. Bill Clinton's like, hey, there's all these people. There's a genocide, which wasn't, but he said there was. There's a genocide going on in Serbia. Meanwhile, he's bombing the shit out of Iraq, starving children to death with the sanctions. Meanwhile, Rwanda's going on. He's not doing anything about that. East Timor's going on. He's not doing anything about that. No, he was doing this to fuck with Russia. I'm like, that's my thing with libertarians. Like, fucking peep game, guys. We know what these guys are doing. This isn't if we cared about humanitarianism, we'd have made Saudi end the war in Yemen 7 years ago. We'd have made, we wouldn't be doing half the thing. Well, where's the humanitarian outrage for what's going on to the Palestinians?
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. But I will, at least the indication on Yemen and the Palestinian situation. But let's go back to a couple things. So first and foremost, you
For
made
the
a
record,
claim
I wasn't
that,
like yelling at you guys on that. This
No,
no,
is
I know
got
you.
topic
I know it's just
worked out.
And quick point. At the very beginning of this, as far as humanitarian goes, at the very beginning of this, I wrote an article saying that we shouldn't get boots on the ground in Ukraine and we should open our borders to Ukrainian refugees.
Yeah,
Those are your humanitarian. That's your humanitarian solution.
and I agree with that completely. But I mean, going back
I know
to
you
the
probably
point,
don't, Dave, but there you go.
Well, I'd say we should work toward negotiating a peace and a ceasefire. It doesn't really make too much sense to me that Ukrainians are going to immigrate all the way over the United States of America. But regardless of that, I'd say right now, all like the best thing we could do is to just say, like, look, we are willing to give these concessions and tell Ukraine you must negotiate with them or you get no more support. We have so much leverage over Ukraine right now. Work out a deal.
Talk about
it's
that
not
for a
going to be
second.
perfect.
Yeah, let's talk about that for a second. I know Josh was trying to jump in there, but let me hit on this topic real quick. So let's say we do negotiate a peace with Ukraine, with Russia, and between Russia and Ukraine. Russia is going to say you can't join NATO to Ukraine. You can't join NATO, and is also you're going to need to disarm. What's going to stop Russia?
Probably give away the
5 years from
Donbass
invading?
and Crimea.
Yeah, and probably give up part of the. What's to stop Russia from invading in another few years when Ukraine is not a member of NATO and has no.
And wait, one more thing that I want to add, Dave, and then I hand it off to you is that the way that we responded in 2014, I think, is in line with what I hear from people like you and from a lot of people in the political space right now is we should just kind of let them take Donbass, let them take Crimea, make a promise that Ukraine will never join NATO, and then just we'll have peace. But I think that 2014 proves that's not the case. Like we kind of turned the other way when it happened, when the annexation of Crimea happened in 2014, and now we're dealing with another full-scale invasion. And I don't think that will actually reduce war. Like if I would make an argument that if Ukraine joined NATO in 2008, probably wouldn't even be dealing with an invasion today. But I'm curious as to what your thoughts are.
So I don't know exactly what was turning the other way about 2014.
I mean, compare the difference between the way it responded then and now. I mean, it's significantly different.
Well, before Vladimir Putin took, it's so even ridiculous to say he took Crimea. He had Crimea the whole time. It's just he had his naval base was there. It was a majority ethnic Russian area. Russia has had Crimea since 1783. Like I don't even know what this means that he took it.
I don't think
yes, when they finally said we're not playing along with this deal anymore, when the new Poroshenko government came in and said we're tearing up your lease, his men left their naval base and said no, you're not. They didn't even, I mean, he did send some backups in, but it's not even like it was an invasion. He had all he needed right there. They weren't taking, and we're not taking Crimea back. That's just not happening. But regardless, to say like, oh, we did nothing when he took Crimea, well, no. Okay, earlier that year and in the previous year, late 2013, we didn't do nothing. We had John McCain and Lindsey Graham and Victoria Nuland making multiple trips over there. Amy Klobuchar too.
Yeah, and I'm not saying we did nothing. I'm saying we did very little compared to now.
No, we didn't. We sent billions of dollars into Ukraine for years before the Maidan revolution, as it's called. That we were always promoting pro-democracy groups, which really, we promote democracy in the country, even though, by the way, there's no question that Yanukovych was democratically elected. The elections were verified by the EU, but we're still promoting all these pro-democracy groups. We're not promoting democracy so much in, say, like Egypt or Saudi Arabia or, Palestine or any of that. We're not respecting the wishes of democracy in Iraq when they ask us to leave, but we really cared about democracy on Russia's bordering country because we're such great people.
Okay.
And then, no, listen, and now we can argue about the coup of 2014. It was absolutely sponsored and funded by the West. And like, this was a response to that. The democratically elected government was overthrown by a violent street putsch, and they decided to tear up the lease for the naval base in Crimea. And Vladimir Putin said, fuck that. So for you to then take that start at Crimea and go, we didn't do anything about that. It's like, no, dude, you got to get out of this empire mindset. We can't do anything about that. There's no question. We can't do that. In the same way that, understand this, let's say we have Guantanamo Bay on Cuba, okay? Do you think Vladimir Putin should let us? If I were to ask you the question, should Vladimir Putin let America have Guantanamo Bay? Wouldn't you immediately just start chuckling to yourself like, he can't stop. He's not letting us or stopping us. There's just no issue. We fuck him up. What, do you want to come over here and fight us? That's what Crimea is.
And I think that same logic carries over to Ukraine. So when I say that is, I believe that the Ukrainian people have a right to determine their future. And I don't think it's as cut and dry for the narrative that I've heard you mention.
I agree with that statement, by the way.
Okay. And that's, I think, And here's the thing. Like, so actually, let me ask you this: if you lived in Ukraine in 2014 and you were watching what would happen with Yanukovych, like in the middle of the night, we're changing our plan. We were going to go partner with the West, where you could have free trade and liberalism, right? Like the ability to have freedom of speech and not be like all these different things that are very, very different than what you would deal with if you were moving to be more aligned with Russia. Would you be on the ground fighting against that? Because I would be. I know many people in my work that were on the ground fighting for that. And so I don't, and not only that, but I don't think the narrative that this is a Western-led coup is, even if there was, let's say, Western resources that were put into it. I think that the people of Ukraine saw what was happening. It's the same thing that's happened in Georgia last week, 2 weeks ago. They see they're torn between two great powers. They could either go with liberalism, where they could have freedom of speech, free trade. I mean, all these things that we take for granted in the United States, or they could go become part of the Russian war machine, the Russian imperialism.
Russia was pouring a lot of money into Ukraine at the time too.
Yeah,
let's not forget
sure.
that.
Yeah. No one's denying that. Sure, absolutely.
So I think the Ukrainian people should have the right to make that decision, and then I don't think Russia's Monroe Doctrine should determine whether, like that should influence them. They should have the right to determine their future. If they wanted to join Ukraine, they should have been able to, assuming the
in an ideal world, like, yes, and Iraq should have a right to not confront us. But if like Vladimir Putin started, I mean, Iraq should have a right to kick us out of Iraq. And like, yeah, I get what you're saying. Now, first off, I don't exactly think I take for granted free speech and free trade in America. I think I wish we had more of it. I don't know. Like this kind of representation that the EU represents, like just these classical liberal values, is like so remote.
Better than Russia.
It definitely represents liberalism far more than Russia.
No, I don't know. I don't know if I agree with that. I don't know if I agree with that at all. I mean, Russia's got its own, like, look, they're all bad options. But the truth is that what happened with the EU deal with Yanukovych was that the EU was making very harsh demands, severe austerity, all these like anti-corruption measures. But when you really look at them, it's just like turn yourself over to the EU corruption rather than our corruption. And then Vladimir Putin came in and he played like a one-man good cop, bad cop kind of. He went like, well, you go with them, then I'm shutting off all your trade. You go with me, you get $5 billion, no strings attached, no austerity, none of this, and kind of won them back over. I do think Yanukovych wanted to make the deal initially. He was in a very difficult spot politically. I don't know what I would have sided with being in Ukraine. Like, I'll talk about this conflict, and I've studied up on it a lot. I think even for me, and I'm not a very humble person, but this might be the moment where I go, I don't know enough about like what it is to be a Ukrainian to say how I would feel in that moment. I do know
that's the tricky part.
Yes, well,
we don't know their personalities, their culture.
Yeah, look, well, according to the Washington Post, and there was a whole bunch of polling, some more reliable than others, is how the Washington Post put it. There's the protesters in the streets in Maidan never had a majority support of the Ukrainian people. So the idea that it's just like, oh, this was all like I think this is you swallowing, at least to some degree, Western propaganda to say like this was a battle between one side, which was like freedom and goodness and everything right, and the other side, which was death and Russia and authoritarianism. That's not really the reality of the situation. The Yanukovych government was incredibly corrupt. No question. I mean, like outrageously corrupt. Ukraine's a corrupt dude. I remember this. It's been a while since I read this, so I might get these details wrong a little bit. But Yanukovych's son, I'm pretty sure he was a dentist, and he was the 5th richest man in Ukraine.
Yeah,
like,
I don't
that's
think
how,
anyone's going to
that's how transparent the corruption is over there.
There was a massive amount. There probably still is. There's almost guaranteed still is. Absolutely corruption in Ukraine. That's not an argument.
Was incredibly corrupt. Poroshenko's government and Zelensky's government now, incredibly corrupt. And the other thing that just doesn't really get reported that much is how insane this fucking Zelensky government has been. They have banned almost all the political opposition parties, nationalized the media. They're fucking banning certain religious ceremonies. Like, this is pretty wild shit. I don't know. It's not like this black and white thing that all of the American politicians try to make it out to be. Oh, this is good versus evil. No, it's not. This is a country that, like, again, I think it's like, it's not. I do agree with you in principle. All people should have a right to self-determination. That doesn't mean America ought to be the policeman of the world. And this has been, to me at least, this has been like the wisdom of the entire classical liberal and libertarian like history of thought, is understanding that it's like, look, yes, we have these principles. We believe in liberty and individual liberty, but we also recognize that there's like these limits to reality. And for you to become the force that's going to, like, you need local enforcement, universal, values. Okay. If you're going to become the force that is now going to police the world and enforce we're going to enforce natural human rights on every human throughout the planet, you're going to be the biggest oppressive force in the world, which America is right now.
Josh, you have a really, let me refocus our discussion real quick.
Sure. What I was about to do.
Because I think we've gotten to the point on Ukraine where you say that we've bought into Western propaganda, and we're going to say that you've bought into Russian propaganda, right? So we're just going to disagree. We're probably never going to get to agree on that. So I think let's move on to that and go kind of refocus back on NATO itself.
Okay, can I just say one thing, just very quickly, just to respond to that?
Yeah.
It's like, it is Western propaganda that Zelensky is this great guy and runs this democracy or something like that. It's what I'm saying. If you're going to accuse me of buying into Russian propaganda, then George Kennan, the founder of the containment strategy, bought into Russian propaganda. Like, it's just, I think there's an asymmetry in those two claims, but whatever, we can move on to something else.
Yeah.
So
just to keep the discussion moving. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Josh.
So one of the things you mentioned was that we need to fight the war machine. We need to fight. I think that was one of the things you ended off there with was, if we're going to go back to liberal values, we need to make sure that the U.S. is involved less in foreign intervention, not the world policeman, which is something that I agree with 1,000,000%. One of the things that I think we brought up at the beginning that we weren't really able to dig into is that I think that NATO's existence, in essence, actually creates less instances in which U.S. is likely to be involved in conflicts. And what I mean by that is that, well, first and foremost, we've already established very clearly that NATO has not created or caused conflicts. Almost every single conflict that NATO has been involved in has been kind of driven by this U.S. intervention that we talked about, with some exceptions. But ending NATO tomorrow wouldn't change the military-industrial complex in the United States. In fact, it actually might serve as an argument for the war hawks to increase spending. If we actually operated the way it should operate, which is that 2% level, I think right now the US is somewhere near 4% of GDP. If we were at 2% level and everyone else in Europe reached their 2% level, which I strongly believe they should do, everyone else that's part of the alliance should reach that 2% level, it would actually create a situation in which theoretically Europe could be subsidizing US defense in a way, right? I mean, we could save $400 billion if we went back to a 2% level. And so this goes back to the thing that I think we talked about at the very beginning is like, I don't think the issue that we have, the issue we both have with world police, with all this foreign intervention, is something that is driven by NATO. I think it actually, because of the way that NATO operates with all the member states, it has created an environment in which there's likely less conflict for the US to even get involved in. I mean, you look at NATO, Europe post-NATO and pre-NATO, and at least between the member states, the conflict has significantly reduced. And the World War I, World War II were us getting involved in conflicts that were caused by people that are now member states of NATO. And so I think that you actually create an environment, if you abolish it completely, you leave it, you blow it up, whatever, where you're more likely to see conflicts spill over and us get pulled into some sort of war. It's the same thing that we talked about earlier with Ukraine. Like, I think that if Ukraine was able to, and they obviously weren't, right? They were corrupt. There were a lot of problems with Ukraine. That's why they didn't join the alliance, and they probably shouldn't have. But if they were able somehow magically to comply, I don't think we would be dealing with the same dynamic we're dealing with today.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of variables there to say you think it would go this way.
It's really all we can do.
I got to say that this just sounds to me like the most unlibertarian argument I could imagine. The best case scenario is then maybe Europe could be subsidizing our defense. I don't think Europe should be subsidizing our defense. I'm not looking for handouts, or like I don't want to be on welfare from Europe, and I certainly don't think Europe should be on welfare from us. If you're like, look, in World War I, they were basically fighting to a stalemate until America joined the war and tipped the balance and led to this total victory, which led to the Treaty of Versailles and Germany's national humiliation. And it led to the rise of the Nazis. It led to the rise of the Soviet Union. It was like the worst decision we ever made. And to me, as far as I'm concerned, I think it's probably, if there were no NATO, I think it would much more likely to be a stalemate type situation in Europe right now. Russia is not dominating Europe. This makes no sense at all. Germany's GDP is way higher than Russia. Italy's got a higher GDP than Russia.
Yeah.
These were numbers before the war. I don't know exactly where they're at right now.
They're
sanctions.
Close enough.
Yeah, I don't know. The sanctions might have actually backfired and upped Russia's GDP, but there's just no, I think that there's no reason for these advanced countries to have their defense. Again, like Eisenhower said, this was like, if we're still here in 5 years, we've failed. And the point was that it was, at least initially, I mean, I still wouldn't have supported it, but at least initially the idea was like, oh, these countries are in tatters, let's subsidize their defense right now. This makes absolutely no sense 70 years later. It's just, there's no reason for us to be like subsidizing them or them to be subsidizing us. Now, in terms of what you're talking about with kind of like this argument, which is the Bill Kristol neocon argument, not saying you agree with them on everything, but that's their argument. And it's not NATO. That this is Pax Americana. This is the liberal world order. This is the post-war World War II global hegemony, or whatever you want to call it. The argument is they've kept the peace. And like, okay, yes, Germany and Russia haven't fought another war, and Germany hasn't invaded France. Okay, there's something to be said for that. Like, yeah, we've kept the peace, except all the places where we haven't. It's like, okay, we've kept the peace in some areas, but in that world order, it's just Vietnam or Korea, then Vietnam, then all the other little minor, skirmishes in the 90s, like Serbia, as we mentioned before.
Yeah.
There's then of course Iraq, the sanction regime on Iraq War II, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Yemen, Pakistan, like all of that. So okay,
that's not NATO.
That's not
NATO. That's the US.
No. But my point is that you're giving NATO credit for what isn't just NATO, is the entire global world order. And like, okay, if you're going to take that credit that this has kept the peace, then okay, you also have to look at what the costs are for that. So no, it's not just NATO. NATO is the European military alliance arm, as you just said, of America, of the American empire. I'm like, yeah.
I don't think if the U.S.
all the places that it hasn't.
Yeah, I don't think if the U.S. left NATO today, it would cease to exist. I think it would continue to exist, and I think it would actually, in a way, we might have a dynamic shift there as to who's paying what into the their own military expenses. But I don't think
I'm an American, so I'd be fine with that, and they can figure it all out. I mean, I'd like libertarianism to sweep every corner of the world, but I try to focus on if I could get my town to be more libertarian, I'd be happy with that. So I'd be happy with America leaving NATO. If America left NATO, NATO is not what NATO is right now. NATO right now is the arm of the American empire. It's kind of like saying, like, if America stops supporting Israel, then what is Israel? It's not the same thing anymore. And so it's going to be a drastically different shakeup over there. I do tend to agree with you that it would be for the better.
So,
or I don't know if I was agreeing with you, but
I know where you.
Yeah, you're fine. So let me ask it this way: what wars? I think we asked this at the beginning, but what wars was NATO directly responsible for starting? Was there any wars that we could have avoided if NATO hadn't ever existed? I don't see any. I think you're misplacing some of your criticism of NATO when we should be directing it at the United States, or like in Libya, France was really heavily involved there.
Yeah,
I think there are other issues.
Sure. Well, I would argue that the Bucharest, the 2008 NATO meeting there, where they announced that Georgia and Ukraine were entering NATO, were at least partially responsible for creating the conditions for the war in Georgia and the war in Ukraine. But that's not saying they started the war exactly. But I think that's kind of not exactly the question. It's like, I don't know, what wars did they start? Well, I'm not exactly claiming they started wars. Again, it's kind of like if you had this organization that was like the Bloods and the Crips and the Latin Kings, and they all have as you call, a voluntary, agreement together. And then the Bloods go out and attack someone, and then the voluntary agreement comes in and like kills a bunch of innocent people. And you're going, well, that agreement didn't start the war.
Well, I mean,
I'm saying the
difference between that analogy, Dave, is just real quick. The difference between that analogy is that in this case, you're not going to have that that institution come in unless there's consensus among the members of the institution to actually act.
Who cares if there's consensus amongst the Bloods and the Crips and the Latin Kings? These are all a bunch of gangsters. Yeah, there's consensus that we should go like overthrow Gaddafi. Okay, I don't care. I'm not like, the question isn't whether they started the wars or not. The question is like, are they a defensive alliance, or are they fighting in wars of aggression, incredibly destructive ones that kill hundreds of thousands of innocent people? You know what I mean? Like that's the question. So yeah, okay, you could say America started the war and then NATO just came in or something like that, or in Libya, put it on France or whatever you want to. But I don't really see like
I don't think that, like, I guess where I'm going with this, if you abolish NATO, I don't think any of those dynamics would change. Like the situation in Libya and Afghanistan, we had 30 countries in Afghanistan. I mean, there were many members that weren't NATO partners there. I don't think
again, this is a false kind of like, or it's just not asking the right question. Yeah, okay, probably if you abolish NATO, but all of these gangs still existed, yeah, probably there would still be some of these gang fights. But that's not an argument for them existing, and that's not a defense for their role that they played in Afghanistan. I mean, like they actually the war got turned over to Afghanistan. The war in Afghanistan got turned over to NATO for a little period of time, although they kind of backed off that and the Americans took back over control. But that was kind of like what enabled America to go focus on Iraq. So no, the existence of NATO does not lead to less of these conflicts. I think the overwhelming evidence is that it leads to much more. And like, look, there would have been a million different ways to do this better. I think the best thing that could have happened, man, is like, if NATO had just been abolished when the Soviet Union collapsed, I think there would have been an unbelievable opportunity, to have like a whole different European dynamic. And I think back then Russia would have really been willing to come to the table a lot more. It's such a shame that this didn't happen when it
actually, I'll give you a couple points there, because I think that the argument for abolishing NATO in the 90s was way stronger than it is today. The reason why is because of what we're seeing with these Russian wars of aggression. And I think that dynamic has shifted for me, at least until this conflict kind of resolves itself. That's one of the reasons why I'm not fully there with you. But I mean, I think that argument actually would be pretty strong in the 90s. And I actually don't disagree with that example. Like,
so I disagree that the dynamic, like, I think it's still a strong argument, but yeah, I mean, look, man, just think like what a show of good faith that would have been. I mean, this is what George Kennan, again, the harsh cold warrior, said. He goes, what are you guys doing in the 90s when the NATO expansion first started? He goes, you're picking a fight with Russia. This isn't the Soviet Union. These are the heroes who overthrew them. Like, why are you treating them like they're the enemy too? And look, even when you see just like this Nord Stream pipeline that, Ukraine or Ukraine allies blew up, and we all know what that is. Like, even when you see that, it's like, what was the Nord Stream pipeline? This was like, think about this from a libertarian or a classical liberal perspective. This was like the greatest thing ever. This, you're talking about like what Europe would look like. Imagine Germany and Russia making this like interconnected business deal where they both benefits, right? Like the old, like where goods don't cross borders, armies do. This was like the worst thing that's ever happened in the history of the world, was when Germany and Russia went to war. I think in World War II, I think it was 30 million people died just in the conflict between Germany and Russia. And here they make this deal where it's like, oh, look, Germany is going to kind of be relying on Russia, and Russia's going to make a whole bunch of money from Germany. They're going to kind of be interdependent. Like, from any libertarian perspective, this is like the greatest thing ever. And so, of course, what is every politician in America, from Donald Trump to Joe Biden to all of them? Oh, this is a problem. You can't be doing business with Russia because they're the big bad Russia. It's like this whole Pax Americana fights at every turn for Russia to be integrated and be peaceful like European neighbors. And honestly, I mean, aside from all of that, like, it's just not our place, man. It's just
understood. You're not gonna actually have me fight at all. I mean, actually, a lot of the reasons why I would agree with you that anyone in Europe should be able to trade with whoever they want is the same reason why I'm so passionate about Ukrainians being able to decide which alliance they want to join or who they want to trade with, and not be threatened by the force of Russia or the U.S. I mean, be bullied around. So I think there's a similar line that kind of goes through that.
I agree. I think Ukraine, in a sense, should be able to join whatever alliance they want to join. I think we should also be able to choose who we want to join in an alliance with, and I don't think we should choose this one. So I'm not even arguing Ukraine shouldn't want to be a part of NATO. I'm saying we shouldn't have them.
Understood.
Because I think it might result in a nuclear war.
Understood. How are we at with time, Casey? I think we're about at our hour.
Yeah, we try to keep it under 45 minutes, but we figured this was just going to keep going. So
yeah, we're way over time.
That's how it goes. Yeah. Do either of you guys have any final summations? Go for it.
I'm happy to kind of summarize my perspective on the whole thing, and then Dave, maybe you could take us out. I think that one of the core things that I'd like to say about this is, if we have a libertarian world, truly like a global libertarian order, the thing that we probably all agree with, and I'm not talking about some sort of military order or anything. I'm talking about a world where countries everywhere embrace libertarian ideas and libertarian values, the idea of cooperation and not coercion, and the idea that people should be free to trade and interact with each other. I think you would see more organizations that operate similarly to NATO, defensive alliances across the world. And I think that while there's a lot of criticism about NATO, and I think we really touched on a lot of that today, and I think it was a very interesting conversation. I think that inherently, which I think we agree with, defensive alliances are not opposed to libertarianism, and you would see organizations like that. And wherever there's people, there's imperfect systems, and I think we all know that wherever there's people, there's imperfect systems. But in a world with a libertarian order, you're going to see a lot more organizations like this. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. But to wrap it up and then hand it off to Dave, I just want to say, I really appreciate you coming in and being like civil and having this conversation. It's very often when we try to engage with this back and forth, especially within the party, it's very toxic and there's like a lot of blocking going on and no one's willing to talk. So really appreciate the fact that you were like sitting here, articulate your views and listening to us, and like having a discourse, like civil discourse, is very enjoyable. And I earned a lot of respect for you. So again, thank you. And I hope we can do it again soon.
Well, thank you very much for that. And I just right back at you. And like, I appreciate that. It is like, look, man, Twitter is just like toxic,
It's toxic.
dude. And I know it's me too. I know I'm not like above it too. Like it's just like these short quips, and the only thing you can do, you can't really elaborate on the point. So the only thing you can do is just try to like dunk on whoever you're going at the quickest. I know I'm as guilty of it as anyone else, but I do appreciate that. I kind of like, I don't know you guys, so I didn't really know what to expect coming into this. I was like, all right, this is gonna go one of two ways. We're gonna have a conversation about these things, or they're gonna be right away like, you're a Nazi or something.
I had a feeling it was gonna do the same thing. It went well. I'm glad.
I appreciate you guys. I'm saying I can do the other way too, but I'd kind of rather do this because this is like what I actually care about. Is like talking about these ideas. So I appreciate that from both of you very much. And I think all of this stuff is important. Oh, dude, that'd be great if Jonathan just left and then just came back cursing me out like right after that. We're having this.
I think his wife walked in the room or something.
I will say that I think that, look, I don't disagree with you that like, look, we want to see a complete libertarian world where the whole world is libertarian. That's like, I am in theory a libertarian universalist. I believe that freedom is like a universal principle and that individual liberty, like I'd love to see a global, embrace of libertarianism. I also think that like you can have these principles and also live within the confines of the real world, and recognize that like it is such a daunting challenge that we would ever turn one country truly libertarian, let alone turn the entire world that way. What would happen if the whole world was libertarian? Maybe there'd be these defensive alliances. Maybe there wouldn't be any of them. Maybe there'd be no entangling alliances, and it would just be like peacekeeping missions and negotiators and stuff like that. I kind of actually think the latter is more likely than the prior, but that's one of the beautiful things about freedom. You don't really know. It's very, very hard to predict. If you were going to predict 100 years ago what free markets would have produced, there'd be no chance you could have gotten it right, no matter what type of brilliant genius you are. There's too many variables. So I don't know about that. I do think that in the real world, like in the situation that we're dealing with right now, we're in an incredibly dangerous situation. And much like what I thought was so heroic about Ron Paul in his like 2008 campaign and that Giuliani moment, which everyone knows of.
I remember it.
Yep. It's not just that he was telling the truth. It's that he was like kind of telling the most unpopular truth. And he was also kind of giving, like, for me personally, the impact it had on me is it kind of like it almost like was like this portal to engage with thoughts that were completely outside of the world that I had even been given permission to engage with. Like, oh, you could think about what the American empire looks like from outside the American empire. And like in the George W. Bush years, it was all like about like how America feels about 9/11. And then you're almost like, oh, wait, there's this whole other world outside of our empire who has a whole feeling about all the 9/11s that we've imposed on them. And that's interesting to think about. And I'm not saying Vladimir Putin's not a bad guy for invading Ukraine, even though I believe he was provoked and that NATO and the US did all this messed up stuff. I still think it's not excusable to invade and kill innocent people. But like, if Ron Paul had just gone on stage in 2008 and said, I think Osama bin Laden's a really bad guy. 9/11 was wrong. Terrorism is bad. I mean, that is technically all true, but it just adds nothing. It's just like there's nothing of value to add there. And I think that libertarians as dissidents to this incredibly tyrannical regime that we live under, like, I think our role is to add the thing that's kind of unpopular that other people aren't saying. And we are dangerously close to like a true calamity here. And I think we should be like, if we're going to do anything, I think we should be pushing to try to end it. Not try to say like these ridiculous ideas that like, well, we're going to just look, what these war criminals in Washington, D.C. want to do is prolong this war for another decade and bleed Russia dry. That's what they want. They think they can do that while avoiding a nuclear war. It's a really, really risky game. I think we should be demanding peace immediately. Demanding an end. What are we doing? We're sending in weapons of war to a hot war on Russia's border. We're basically committing an act of war. We're treating Ukraine like they're a NATO country, even though they're not. And this is madness, and I'm against it. Again, thank you guys both so much for having me. I did really enjoy this.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And no, I was not cussing you out. One of my kids walked in, even though they should have been in bed like an hour or two ago. So
I appreciate. I get that. So I got babies. So like
I do too. How many babies, Dave?
Here. Well, I mean babies when I say I think of them. My daughter's 4 and my boy's 1. So
okay, I have a 1.5-year-old and I'm about to have the second one. So wish me luck.
Oh, congratulations, dude! That's awesome.
Yeah, the second one is so much easier. Third one's the easiest. And it's not. It's like the third one just doesn't even exist. He like floats around and you never see or hear him. At least
good to know. Good to know.
I think I saw a Jordan Peterson clip where he was like, "You guys, I recommend having 3 kids because like once you got 2."
Hey, that's my number, Dave. That's where I'm ending it. We're going to try to go for 3 and then call it there. So we'll see how it goes. I'm one of 6, and that was too much chaos.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
I would do 6 in a second, but it's all about what my wife will do. I will have as many kids as she will have for me.
I feel that.
She does have to do a lot more.
For sure. All right, Dave. Thanks for jumping on. Appreciate the conversation. You have a good evening.
Absolutely, you too, guys, and congratulations. Best of luck with everything, Joshua.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.